It's the individual. And the focus, and that's what I see here today, that's where we are now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gula. I'm now going to invite Paul to address us briefly, and I think it's appropriate that we listen to Paul. Just by way of background, I have spent the best part of 50 years of my life in South Africa, having lived through apartheid and the miracle democracy that we've experienced. And I think one of the fundamental things that Unilever did in South Africa, it was that it built leadership. And for that, we owe you a deep sense of gratitude as the South African people. So the table is yours, Paul.
I've been asked to take a little bit more time, but before I give you some of my thoughts, I just want to first congratulate David and his wife, Karine, who actually got the baby. David Jones, he got the baby yesterday. I think that's a round of applause, no? He claims he did a lot of work for it. I don't think so. But thanks to David and thanks to Kate for organizing this wonderful Young World event. It is very clear that there's energy in the room, that I can tell you. If you turn that positive energy into the right direction, boy, can you make change. And being part of that in itself is tremendously energizing. Last year I was in Venice at a conference where someone asked me to speak, and there was a panel. I met actually Ajarat Bade from Nigeria, who I think is here in the audience now. I haven't seen her. But she was talking to me about the 8th missing millennium goal. No wars in the name of religion. Her passion that came through, how she captured the audience. It struck a chord. And then on that same day, I met Oscar Morales, someone you will see later today. A leader who single-handedly got people in the street to protest in Colombia against violence, and in this case, the FARC. 2 leaders taking personal charge, 2 leaders driving change. There's no doubt in my mind that we meet at a very turbulent time. You can open the papers every day. This is a world that is challenged, and these challenges are daunting and numerous. And as you've heard from the questions, sometimes difficult to know where to begin and how to start. Never have the issues been more pressing, and never have the needs for leadership been more burning. If you look at the interdependent challenges that we face on food security, poverty reduction, sustainability of resources, climate change, and social and economic and environmental development, these challenges have never been greater. And I believe that these pressures will only increase as about 2 more billion people enter this world, and many aspire to improve their living standards. But there are the risks that we don't end up doing the right things for the long term with the short-term economic pressures that we have. That would be my biggest concern. We call this world, or I would call this world, a VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And frankly, we need your help. We cannot do it alone. Advancing the human tide in this world, improving people's standards of living, alleviating poverty that you talk about, is something that we all jointly need to take responsibility for. Historically, we have relied actually too much on governments or international institutions to help us through these tougher times. Not so anymore. I think the financial crisis of 2008 that turned into an economic crisis is actually becoming rapidly a political crisis. The political system or the international institutions, in my opinion, actually have broken down, if you like it or not. Witness how difficult it is to get a Doha round after 10 years of discussions. That in itself would lift 300 million people out of poverty. Witness how difficult it is to make progress on climate change or to get financial stability deals in the current environment. Election cycles have shortened, and I hate to say, so has political courage. With the bigger risk that the crucial long-term issues that you are here addressing, that you are going to be part of, will not be addressed sufficiently. But fortunately, as Aaron was talking about, you have the power to shift this. There are some things happening in unpredictable ways, which is the spread of technology. People find themselves increasingly empowered to drive change, from the basic mobile phones to the social platforms, obviously. People are discovering the power of these networks. It's giving them a voice. It's giving them a voice outside of the political sphere. I would argue that a regime in Egypt was toppled in 6 weeks' time as the first example of the social revolution. Earth Hour, which originally started with WWF, if I'm not mistaken, now gets 1 billion people to turn off their lights for 1 hour across the world. 1 billion people. That's nearly 1 in 7 citizens. The power of the social networks. Just like Oscar Morales or President Obama were getting elected as young leaders because they understood the power of this new media. They understood that it would lead to yes, we can. And yes, we can is true for more and more people. But you cannot do it alone, as many of you have pointed out. Business has a role to play, and certainly business has a responsibility. It is very clear that business models need to change first and foremost, to drive business models more to a sustainable and equitable growth. And these two words are very important, sustainable as well as equitable. There is a Chinese proverb that says if you don't change direction, we likely end up where we're going. And frankly, where this world is going is not a pretty sight. And if some businesses don't get it, that they have to be part of the solution, I think you're smart enough to use these same social forces that I was talking about to actually make them dinosaurs. The simple power you have is a very powerful power, which is just simply not to buy their products anymore. If you can topple a regime in Egypt in 6 weeks' time, you can topple in today's world a company in nanoseconds. And Libya. Good. Now, for that we need new business models, but we also need new leadership. And let me briefly talk about the two. The first thing is what is very clear, and I hope you would understand that as well, that business has a very important role to play in this world, where growth is very important. You need to create jobs. There are 40 million people coming to this world net of ones that leave every year. They need to be taken care of. You need to create jobs. You need to provide products to improve many people's lives. We've chosen for social systems, rightfully so, like healthcare, education, and others that need to be provided for. In fact, globalization, the right of business to sell and market their products across the world, has lifted nearly 1 billion people out of poverty in places like China, India, and many other ones. In the developed economies, where we're here in Europe or the US, it's equally important that the role of business is to provide that growth. In some places, the biggest worry I have is the worry actually of social cohesion. That your generation, I'm not worried about you with your energy, but your generation is getting excluded from society. If you see that youth unemployment in Spain or Greece or many other places is rapidly approaching 40% now, we have a need to reignite growth. We have a need to create jobs and make it inclusive and equitable growth. That is absolutely very, very important. The reason why we need to change, it's very simple to me. It cannot be right in today's world that 1/4 of its inhabitants have literally nothing to live on, and almost 1 in 5 still live in extreme poverty, whilst fewer and fewer people are amassing the wealth. It simply cannot be right that 965 million people go to bed hungry every night, and a child dies every 6 seconds from malnutrition, whilst at the same time, another part of the world is over-consuming and is facing escalating rates of obesity. It simply cannot be right that we are consuming the world's scarce resources at a higher rate than the world is able to replenish. In fact, WWF has done a study and already mentions that we live currently off 1.3 Earths already. If we would live like everybody in Europe, we already need 3 Earths. We would live like an American, we would need 5 Earths. And that is before 2 billion more people enter. We simply cannot go on the way we're doing it. Either way, the fact is, we only have one world and we need to take care of that. Business as usual will certainly not get us there, that I can tell you. And business has to increasingly ask themselves the question on how can they play the role to make society better, socially, economically, and environmentally, rather than just how can I maximize profit and minimize costs. I know a lot of businesses work under that premise, but I would say that's not a good business model anymore. Business models, business leaders will need to understand that indeed with the liberty to operate in many countries in the world, like Unilever, about 150 countries, also comes the responsibility to be co-solution providers for the world's issues. I like Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor, who wrote in his book, Man in Search for Meaning, that when they built the Statue of Liberty on the east coast of the United States, they actually forgot to build the Statue of Responsibility on the west coast. These two go hand in hand. And yes, it is enlightened self-interest, but there's nothing wrong with enlightened self-interest. I have 3 children. That's an interest. I cannot keep stealing from them or from future generations. But it's also very clear that businesses themselves cannot succeed in societies that fail. People that are at the bottom of the pyramid, societies that have corruption, are not exactly the most conducive ones for us to sell our products in. Take Unilever. We go back about 100 years or a little bit more. We started when Lord Lever provided soap in Victorian Britain, when hygiene was a big problem. It was to provide a solution. Throughout that, we've done well as the company grew to what is now 45 billion euros, about 170,000 people operating in about 150 countries. We built our business throughout those years by a strong belief of doing well by doing good. A belief that the success of our business is actually deeply linked with the success of the society in which we operate. In fact, you might have seen a recent article of Michael Porter in the Harvard Business Review, beginning of this year, where he talked about shared value, moving away from this single-minded focus on maximizing shareholder value that is still happening way too often, to actually maximizing value for all stakeholders, your people in the company, the communities in which you live and work, the consumers. I've often been quoted by saying that I really don't work for the shareholders. We work for the consumer and for society. And frankly, if we do that well and stay focused on that, I can tell you the shareholders will be rewarded. But the single-minded focus led us to the problems that we saw in 2008 in the first place. So there we go. We have a long history of doing the right things, and hopefully doing the right things, starting the Sustainable Agricultural Initiative or the Sustainable Fishery in the 90s, creating the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil to produce the sustainable palm oil that we have now. By the way, illegal deforestation is 16% of the global warming. You don't need technology. You need to just find a way to stop illegal deforestation. Now, we are encouraged by the progress that we are making. We've decided actually to go a step further and to embrace a radical business model that moves from just reducing the negative impacts to society, where still too many people are focused on, to actually move to how can you make a positive contribution to society. In fact, most companies will operate obviously on the right side of the law, but they will ask themselves, how can I use society and the environment to be successful? We're trying to shift that thinking literally 180 degrees and say, how can we be successful whilst making society and the environment better? And that requires a fundamental change in how you run your business. It requires a fundamental change in the business model. That's what we call the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan that David referred to when he introduced me. We set a very simple goal here. To double our business, you need to grow, but to reduce our overall environmental impact. In fact, decouple growth from environmental impact. Not only carbon, all of it. It's an audacious goal that makes us nervous, but it can be done. I haven't heard any company of our size make that commitment, and yet we need it for more. If we would only succeed, and the rest of society wouldn't, we would still be failing, that I can tell you. We've also said that we want 1 billion people to improve their health and well-being. It's actually more than a single government could provide. A company like ours is able to make that commitment and hopefully live up to that commitment because 2 billion consumers use our products every day. And then a third commitment to source 100% of our agriculturally based materials sustainably. We're committed to do that by the year 2020, and we're well on our way. It takes an approach across the total value chain, from sustainable sourcing to sustainable living. It covers all of our brands, all of our categories. It is the business model, it is the strategy. And it has very specific targets and projects, obviously, behind that anybody can see. Transparency, transparency, transparency is indeed important. And again, technology allows you to access that very quickly, and also in our case. We're working, for example, with Oxfam to look at improving the livelihood, and we've set a simple goal to do that with 500 million farmers. 95% of the poverty actually is in the agricultural sector. Smallhold farmers is a big opportunity there. Or working with WWF or the rainforest to move to sustainable palm oil. The Shakti program in India, Shakti meaning strength. 45,000 women now making their livelihood distributing our products, going to 100,000 by the end of the year. Or the introduction of a water product called Purit, where for 1/15 of the cost, people can get clean drinking water out of any water source, from the rivers in Calcutta to wherever it is, and people need water. 5 million people already having access to this. Or our Lifebuoy product, teaching people how to wash hands. Infectious diseases still kill about 6 million people every year. You can cut that in half just by getting them to wash their hands. So what we call the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan is not an add-on. It is a new business model. But we simply cannot do that alone. We have to do that with everybody together, yourselves and other stakeholders. It also requires a different business environment, much more focused on the long term. The problems of 2008 that we had were as much the problems of short-termism and greed than anything else. We've started to abolish guidance to the market. We don't report anymore on a quarterly basis. We've changed our compensation systems for the long term so that people in our company can focus on doing the right thing for the long term. And what we find actually in doing that there is no compromise in delivering on the short term as well. But it leads you like a lighthouse, like a beacon, to the right decisions to run your business. So this is a fast pace of change that we're seeing in this world, and we certainly have to learn a lot ourselves to also find solutions to these challenges. And this is where you come in, because I think that the young people, you that are represented here, not only are the fast learners, but you also are better in touch with what is happening in society. In fact, I would submit you care a little bit more because you have a lot more time ahead of you than many others of us. You also understand how to bring in fresh ideas. You're not pre-programmed. You have the courage. You have the conviction to help us get to these audacious goals that we set ourselves. The real reason why we want you at the table, is to help us drive that change. I believe that the world has woken up, for example, to climate change, not just because of a few politicians or scientists, or a movie called The Inconvenience Truth. They all helped, there's no doubt about that. But it was because of the young people like you, fearful for their future, that have been demanding change from their parents, from their governments, and from the companies from which they buy products. I'm clear that you play a crucial role in this process. So I like the resolution that you have today, and I certainly would fully support it. Which brings me briefly to the issue of leadership. You cannot do these models if you don't have the leadership. More than ever, we need leaders that are stepping up to the plate to drive this change. It was actually Winston Churchill who famously observed, it simply isn't enough to do our best. Sometimes we have to do what is required. And in this world, we are at a point of no return if we don't do what is required. It requires courage. It also requires what Jim Collins calls authentic leadership. Leaders who operate with a sense of purpose for their work and other pursuits, like you have clearly expressed an enormous sense of purpose. Leaders who know themselves, but also care about others they touch. Leaders who understand the strengths and the flaws of themselves, knowing that they're not perfect, pulling in others to help them reach these broader solutions. Leaders who attribute greatness more to their followers than to themselves, who put the interest of others ahead of their own, who care about this planet indeed with the brain and with the heart. For a company like ours, it simply means putting a CEO like myself at the bottom of the company, not at the top, to the service of others. When people ask me what my job is, I always say very simply, to make others succeed. The definition of a great leader is changing rapidly, just as the traditional barriers of leadership are breaking down. The leader potential, more than ever, is in the hands of people who can access, analyze, and use information strategically, which in fact is you, far better than us. That's the younger generation, able to harness together this enormous collective power that you have. Not surprisingly, we like to tap into that to reach our goals of the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan that I talked about. You're a special group. You're well placed to lead this change. The world needs you, you care. That's why you're here. I've already seen that you have the purpose, the passion, and the positive attitude to succeed. Many of you are already making a difference. The road ahead will certainly not be easy, and it will be full of challenges. But again, once more, running away from that is not an option. Just let me conclude with the renowned poet, David Frost, an American poet, who had his poem called The Road Not Taken. He ends the poem with a very simple thing. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that made all the difference. Good luck in your journeys.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you for the case study, and hopefully listening to the Unilever case study gives you an indication of how things that you spoke about this morning are in fact happening in business, and maybe we should encourage, as you rightly say, to get the list going so more companies do more of what Unilever is doing. Suleiman, I'm going to come to you at the end and just open it up a little bit, if I may. I'll just go to